I'd been out till 2:45. Would you lock the door? Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64?
Well, look, I think it's vital that towns like Wedderburn have a facility, because every little town around Wedderburn has one. Wedderburn just seems to miss out on a lot of things.
Tell me the story of your father in terms of his last few years.
He was a second generation Wedderburnite, I suppose. His father was born in Wedderburn, he was born in Wedderburn. They very rarely left Wedderburn. The only time they went out of Wedderburn was to go to a specialist or somebody in Bendigo. So they sort of looked upon their community as their blanket, I suppose. You know, community is very, very different in country towns compared to cities. So he never ever wanted to leave his hometown. So he had, in his last years, he lived until he was 91. I would say for the last 6 years his quality of life wasn't good. He had emphysema. He was on oxygen for the last 4 years of his life full time, so he had to cart this tank around with him. So Dad stuck his heels in and said, I'm not going anywhere. And for the last 12 months of his life, you could see him slowly deteriorating to the point where I would say for the last month of his life, he didn't eat at all. He was quite happy to just sit there and starve himself to death.
Why do you think it's important to have an aged care facility here in Wedderburn?
For people to go into an aged care facility shouldn't mean the end of their life. But I believe going away from your town to another aged care facility is virtually the end of you as far as your friends are concerned.
What do you mean by that?
Well, your friends are roughly the same age as yourself, and if you need to be away in a home, there's very little chance of them being able to visit you.
What was that like? Was it a big adjustment to have her half an hour down the road as opposed to being here in her hometown?
Yes, it was an adjustment for us in the sense that we had to deliberately set aside time when we wanted to do it, but just work everything around that 2 hours that we spent with her every day. But it did also mean that her friends couldn't pop in. It also meant that I couldn't take her outside in a wheelchair and take her for a walk around the streets and things like that, which is what I had been doing before she went into care.
Had she talked to you about what it was like to be placed in aged care in Inglewood and what that meant for her?
She would cry a lot that we weren't there, that she couldn't be home and she wanted to come home. And slowly she accepted it reluctantly.
But was she crying over the fact that she'd left home, or was she crying over the fact that she'd left her hometown?
A combination of both, I'd say. One, that she didn't see people where she liked to see people, and two, we were so far from her. To Mum, it would be like we'd be on the moon, not just 20 minutes down the road. We're so far away from her, and she couldn't come home, and she couldn't do her sewing, and she couldn't do her puzzles, and she just, everything familiar had just been taken from her in an instant.
So what was that like? Why was he put in St Arnaud? Why wasn't he in Inglewood? Because St Arnaud seems almost an hour away.
We just couldn't get anywhere else, and St Arnaud had a place for him, so we took it.
So tell me about that. Tell me about the trip over there.
Oh, well, at first it was I was a bit nervous about the whole thing because I didn't know the road all that well. But once I got to know it, I didn't mind it. I knew how far I had to go and where to go, and I used to take the truck route in the St Arnaud and get onto the Donald Road to get to the nursing home.
So were you doing that trip on your own?
Yes.
Did he get many visitors when he was there? Like, who would visit him?
Not very many at all. Only occasionally he'd get a visitor from this way, not much at all.
Tell me then how they've both wound up in Ararat. Tell me about that story, how that happened. Like, your father then went from Inglewood to Ararat and then eventually your mother followed.
Well, when Mum had her accident, we needed to find a place after 12 weeks for Dad, so we looked around Bendigo. We weren't satisfied with some of the facilities there. There was one that we visited. It was huge. And when they showed me a room, they had one vacancy. And the room looked out onto a wall. Now, Dad's a farmer. He's lived in the outdoors all his life. So I live near Ararat. I'm only half an hour away. The only problem is I was half an hour away, so I could keep an eye on. The boys, they're 2 hours away. None of his friends can see him. Dad, if he had have been in Wedderburn, someone could have driven him to the farm. He went to the farm every day in his ute. It's a feel of a place. It's his soul's here. He can sit out in the veranda. Where the facility is, or where they're planning to build it, he had the sale yards across the road. He was a stock agent. He was a real estate agent. So there would have been that feel of somewhere, the smell of the eucalyptus, familiar people. You know, he just loved this place, his farm, his dogs, the people in the town.
You're both in your 80s. Have you discussed aged care and the future amongst yourselves in terms of what you would possibly like to do?
We're hoping that we can get something in our own town before we have to make a final decision.
Now, if that doesn't come about, what are the other options for you? Have you looked into anything?
Well, we'll certainly have to leave our friends, and that's our big disappointment of having to lose all our friends. And at our age, it's be virtually impossible to start new friendship of any depth.
If I'd been out till 3:15, would you lock the door? Will you still need